Okay, so again, hello everyone, and welcome to this new session of the Wednesday seminar on the economics of migration. I have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Giovanni Peri from UC Davis. And I guess that you all know Giovanni, who is probably one of the most prolific authors in the field. So Giovanni produced seminal contributions on the impact of immigration on the US and European labor markets, on economic inequality, on innovation. He has other papers on the determinants of migration, including the effect of global warming on migration, and he published in the very best journals. So he's going to speak today about integration policy for refugees. And this is a joint paper with 4 co-authors. So Giovanni, we are delighted to have you on board. And I think that we have Mette and Linea Hasager. We will also be there for answering the questions online. So the floor is yours for 45 minutes.
Thank you, Frédéric. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here. I'm so glad I can reach you all guys in this format, which is very effective, if not as exciting as to be there in person. So let me jump into the paper and confirm that this is a paper with Jacob, Iben, Mette, and Linea, and Mette and Linea are gonna take some of your questions. And the paper is about integrating refugees. So the key question here that we start from is the idea that refugees are somewhat of a problematic group of immigrants. Problematic in quote, meaning that refugees, because of their characteristics, maybe because of their recent experience, they have proved relatively hard to integrate in Europe. And there is extensive literature that shows that their labor market performance is significantly worse, not just relative to that of native, but relative to other immigrants. They are often, even in the long run, they have an employment gap with native in the order of 20%, 30%. They have earning gaps. Often when you take other measure and indicator of their social integration, such as crime, you observe higher level. On the other hand, I mean, in part, refugees are a very important group per se, because there have been some recent episodes of increase in refugees flow from Syria, earlier on from Afghanistan, Iraq. But also they are a little bit representative of those immigrants who come from different countries and with different skills, which are not super easy to integrate. But as I said, on the other hand, there is a sense in which refugees in particular could be a group that with a targeted and helpful initial help, there could be quite some success. There is a significant recent evidence, again, that refugees arriving in Europe are somewhat positively selected among the people who left, many of which are in refugee camps elsewhere. They don't make it into Europe. The idea is that they come with the trauma, and if they are able to overcome this initial trauma and negative experience, maybe they are up on and running for a good and successful life. And then there is also the fact that in other countries outside of Europe, like in the US, refugees, refugees have had incredibly good success story. In the US, the success story of Vietnamese or Cambodian or ex-Soviet Union refugees is sort of symptomatic. So the question is, do we know anything about what policies are really effective in promoting the success and the economic success of refugees? To give you a little number and to frame this problem, we're going to jump to Denmark, which is going to be the focus of our study because of what we look at. But these 2 graphs represent a little bit in a simple form the extent of the problem of integration of refugees. These 2 graphs shows for the cohort of refugees that we actually will study in the paper, so the refugees who arrived in Denmark around the year 1999, how their employment and how their income earnings in US dollar fared relative to that of natives in blue and natives with low skill in red. So you see that refugees, I will come back to this, start at a level of income and employment very low, in fact, because at this time they were prevented from working while they were waiting for the decision, the declaration of refugees. And then they converged for a while. Then in the period here, this coincides with the period of the Great Recession in Europe and the debt crisis. This convergence stopped, slowed, and maybe even a little bit reversed. So The fact that even in the very long run, after 18 years, refugees are still at a significant disadvantage. I was mentioning the 25 point of employment difference with the similar natives, makes this group, as I said, and makes the group that we consider in Denmark as definitely problematic. So there is a room for improvement. I'm showing this, and I'm here actually just referring to the fact that graphs like this have been done for France, for England, for Sweden, for many European countries. And so Denmark is quite representative in this. And what we're going to say, we're going to try to argue that we say for Denmark, we can learn something that is useful for other countries as well. So what policies should we think about? So as I said, there is a big agreement that if one can identify some policies which are effective in integrating refugees, there are big economic and fiscal return. Economic, because these refugees could converge to native, could increase their earning, their working employment rate. Fiscal, because obviously their tax paying rate will increase. But where there is disagreement, and even before the disagreement, there is a little confusion because there is not a lot of evidence, is which one are the policies that are most. I list here three types of policy, let me put it this way, that are essentially all the types of policy which have been, or the most prominent that have been applied to this group. One are policies that try to help immigrants, and in that particular case, refugees, to find a job. So connecting them with employers or stimulating them to look for a job, giving them opportunity. The second is trying, refugees in most countries have a welfare transfer in the early years of their life in order to help them sort of to, hit or get set and start in a good way. But the question is, should the country, the receiving country, set up some incentive for them to search in the form of reducing this transfer, giving them less of this welfare transfer so that this will push them in some way to search in the labor market. And the third group of policies are, so here is the policies are manipulating their incentives through manipulating their benefits and transfer. And then the third group is maybe the big hurdle for them in order to integrate is that they don't have some of the important human capital, specific human capital to the destination country, so teach them some relevant skills. In this three type of policy, our paper will have to say something about two of them. And in particular, the policy that we target, which is a very simple policy, I like always having, so the bottom down, very simple question is, how much does it pay in terms of a lot of outcome teaching refugees language skills? That's the core question of the paper. Now, there is a long literature about how language skills are important for immigrants, as you see this. And a bunch of this literature is about the fact that in a form or another, there is a very strong positive association between the ability of speaking the language of the country and the success in terms of economic success, labor market success, integration success. And obviously, this correlation is very hard to argue causal things. People have used the fact that people are, who arrive earlier and learn the language better are better than people who arrive later. But even here, there are so many other things besides just language that enter that: exposure to culture, exposure to local human capital. So while there is a general sense in which a language is very strongly correlated with success of immigrants, the causal understanding on how language affects many of their outcomes is much less developed. In fact, while there are several papers on the integration of refugees, here I'm just citing two papers because relative to this is where I think we do a little bit of a further step. They are the closest one and relatively recent. So the two papers that try to look at the effect of language training on refugees are one by Servimäki and Hamalainen, who actually use a reform in Finland that increased the amount of language training, but also of other type of training, such as skill vocational training, and look at the impact of this. As I said, they are more evaluating a bundle of things of which language is an important part, but is not the only one. They look at employment and labor market outcome, and they don't look at other outcome outside of the labor market. And given that they don't sort of track the dynamics and track the second generation also, they don't look at very long run effect of this intervention. And then the one which is maybe more similar, but as we will go argue on the throughout, we think also we do a little bit of few steps forward relative to this by Lockman, Rappaport, and Speciale. This paper is about teaching a language in France and how much qualifying for an extra 100 hours of language classes affects the labor market outcome of these refugees. Even this is focused this is more focused on the short run for the type of data they have, 1 or 2 years out. And the identification uses a discontinuity in a score in terms of initial score in terms of language proficiency. Which is similar in terms of discontinuity, but not the same type of discontinuity that we use. And I find this paper very interesting. However, the effect that they find are also a little puzzling, and they have a long part in which they try to explain this in the sense that here it seems that a language increases a lot participation in the labor market, but not really employment. So you have to guess that they increases a lot of unemployment in these people. And they don't find an effect on language skill proficiency per se, but they argue that the effect comes through network or other indirect effects. So I would argue that in terms of evaluating how much language affects many outcomes of immigrant and refugee in a causal way, we still don't know too much. The second part that we can also evaluate with our paper is how much welfare cuts matter. So this is the part of creating incentive for refugees to find a job. And the idea is do welfare cuts also help push a refugee into the labor market, and do they have other consequences? Here, the paper of reference is also a paper on Denmark. They use another reform, which is a cut in 50% in the benefit to refugees, which was implemented in 2002. And this paper finds that, yes, these cuts increase the amount of labor market participation and employment of refugees, but on the other hand, they also reduce their income, increase their crime, and reduce children education. So it has some side effects, which are also not desirable in a sense, although some of the refugees are pushed. So relative to this, what do we do? So here we have a regression discontinuity that I will describe approach. So an approach that I think in causal terms is very clean with the data which are very much more dense around the discontinuity than what has been done before. So allow us much more precision. And we can estimate the short and long run. Short run means within 2-3 years. Long run means within 20 years. Causal impact of this enhanced language training. Of course, we can evaluate a specific form of language training enhancement, which is what we have in the reform. And we can look at the effect of this on employment and earnings, which is typical, but also on additional education that the refugee gets in the country, which is an interesting, and as we will turn out, an important channel to see this effect play out and develop. On the other hand, we can also ask a little bit more specific question on the dynamic of the labor market effects, asking why do people improve their labor market? Do they do better jobs? Do they re-qualify themselves in some form? Do they go and move in places of the country where there are better jobs? And so we can say a little bit about it. Then, given the nature of the reform, we can also estimate the effect of this, of reduced welfare on a subgroup. As I will describe, this reform changes mainly the language training for refugee, but also cuts the welfare for a group only temporarily. So we can say something about also this additional effect, although not as sharply in terms of identification. I think the set of the bundle of results that I will show you will indicate some things pretty clearly. And then, given the language is really being advocated as much more than just affecting employment, language is learning the culture in part, language is being assimilated. So we can look at the effect of this on other social variables that affect immigrants. In particular, we look at their crime propensity, we look at some family outcome, and then we look at their children. If having learned better language and so likely being more integrated in the society affect the children who were kids and young and growing up in the period when their parents, refugee parents, were integrating, and look at the effect. And here, to anticipate the results very quickly, because I hope I will get to them, we find actually a permanent effect on employment rate, which is an increase by 4%. I will comment on the size. It's a big size, but it's not revolutionary. It's not that it's bringing refugees to the level of native, but it's a big, significant change. It's almost 20% of their employment rate. And in earnings, also a big increase, $2,500 per year on a permanent basis, which relative to their initial income is very large, but again, is not enough to bring them all the way up. We find very interesting dynamic in the labor market. This effect works through the fact that refugees seems to get, after they learn language better, additional education and move into more communication intensive type of job that pay somewhat better. And in terms of the impact of reducing benefit, we don't find incentive effect. Although, as you will see, our policy instrument is not maybe as massive as the language, and so maybe is not large enough to find effect. But we find one interesting effect, which is very sharp and very clear, which is when this group gets lower benefits, they tend to be a little bit more likely to commit property crimes. In fact, the outcome they will look is from shoplifting at supermarkets. So that seems to be the crime that is more affected when these people are cut off some of the resources. So we'll comment a little bit on that. And then on family and children, we don't find that the language training affect fertility of people, but it seems to affect somewhat their mobility in the country. And in the second generation, it seems to affect significantly male children of the refugees, in particular in their school, in some of their school outcome and in their crime. And I will get to this. There is a very big literature that says the boys are very sensitive, especially to the environment at home involving the father. And in fact, we find that having the father who has taken this course and having an improvement in language seems to affect significantly the outcome of the children. Okay, so let me talk about the policy. So I sort of, in the interest of time here, because I had to cut something, I didn't put up a slide with the history of refugees in Denmark. But keep in mind that Denmark has a history of refugee in which all refugees who arrive get some, once they are recognized, the status is recognized, they get some monetary help, and they are resettled in local communities for the first years, and there are some services are offered. In particular, one integration service which was always offered is a language training, but the 1999 reform really substantially restructured this language training which were offered. And in particular, the 4 things that were added, and so what we will evaluate is the bundle of this 4 effect, is that the number of hours which were offered and sort of paid for centrally increased by 430 hours. So exposure to language training increased by about 30%. The system was better founded, and national tests were introduced, and teachers were better selected by identifying sort of more qualified people. And then this was made mandatory. This program was made mandatory from not, where mandatory means that if you want to achieve at the end of the period, or if you want to achieve permanent residence status in Denmark, you need to prove that you have taken that. And that seems to be an important part. Finally, it was also added a small course in civic understanding. So strictly speaking, there is something a little bit more than just language. There is this, but this is only 20 hours relative to the 400 plus hours. And so we're going to call this language training. So what we're going to call expansion of language training is the combination of these 3 things. 4. Then how do we identify this effect of work incentive or modifying the transfer? So at the same time, when this reform was introduced, there was also the introduction of a temporary cut in welfare benefits for people, for refugees, which were older than 25 or had children. So the idea was to put people who were in prime age for the labor market, to give them further incentive to find a job, and so cut in part their welfare benefits that they received from the government. And this cut was 25 to 30%. So large, substantial, but not as large as the cut that was approved later in 2002 and which is studied in this other analysis, which was more like a 50% cut. So the idea here is that government want to introduce, at least attempted to introduce, for a group, and then the group which is left out, which we will analyze, is the group 18 to 25. So this group of quite young people is left out. And so with the due cautions, we can use a little bit the extra policy on the group of 25 older relative to the no extra policy on the group 18-25 to see if this cut of welfare had an effect. What allows us to identify the effect is the fact that there was this very sharp discontinuity in the application of the policy. In fact, the policy was passed in April 1998, and the policy came with this provision that all refugees which arrived in the country from January 1st, 1999 on were subject to the new rules, and the one who had arrived before January 1st were subject to the old rules. So the policy, both the welfare cut and the language enhancement, was applied to this group. Let me start addressing how good is this discontinuity in terms of randomness around of the distribution around itself. So one thing that I would say to premise here is that this law was, as I said, discussed and passed in April 16th, 1998. Most of the people who apply for refugees status on average have to wait a year, actually a year and a month was the average waiting period. And so more than 70% of the refugees who will be, having recognized status around January 1st, 1999, had already applied even before this law was discussed.
Giovanni?
Yep.
Quick question on background. How quickly can refugees enter the labor market in Denmark in the period of time that you're looking at? Is there some stand down period before they're allowed to work?
Yeah, so they cannot enter the labor market when they are waiting for a decision, but as soon as they are allowed to be to recognize, so they won't be while they're waiting, but as soon as they are declared as refugees, they can.
But they can't take the language courses until they're declared. I'm just wondering if the language course is a bit of a lock.
Yep.
Potentially, if you're doing the language course intensely, it might reduce your labor supply in the short run.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, we will see that it will. So we will measure everything from the time they start the course, but they can enter the labor market at different time. And in fact, we will see, definitely it will reduce the ability of being in the market early on when you're taking the course. Yeah, it's a good point. So sorry, I thought I had, but I don't. I thought I had a slide on just introducing the first data, but I'm going straight to the data and the discontinuity. So the idea is this.
Giovanni.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a question, a clarification on the policy as well. So I understand from recent work by Anna Pildam that there was also change in the way the dispersal policy was implemented in Denmark before.
Yeah, so there was. So this change was, strictly speaking, the change was as follows. Before the reform, there was always a negotiation between the Refugees Authority and individual municipalities to decide the quota that each will take. After this reform, there was more of a formula in which there were some allocation originally by a group of municipalities, and then within these groups, so there was a quota which was given, and within this group, the distribution was more decided by them. So there was this other change that we discussed at length in the paper, and I'm going to show you. So one question would be, did this reform, which changed in a way which is not clear how it would have changed the allocation, there is no mechanical relationship, but who did change the allocation of refugees? And so we're going to test if around the discontinuity, there is any sign that the new system allocated these refugees in any different way geographically relative to before, because that could be something that dirties our identification. You're right, Francesco. So in order to show and to see how the discontinuity works, let me first show the official data. The official data, quote unquote, that you receive from the municipality ask how many of the refugees, what percentage of the refugees signed up for this new and enhanced program, and how many hours did this group of refugees signed up for. And here, from data that you get from municipalities, which, as I said, are the units that carried on this policy, there seems to be a massive and clear discontinuity, meaning that people who were recognized as refugees before, 0 is January 1st, 1999, have a very low rate of being enrolled enrolled in this enhanced program, and people who arrive after have a very high enrollment rate. And similarly for hours of language training, there is a very big discontinuity of, in fact, more than 1,500. These, though, are data that come from the authority that should implement that. So the question is, did these people who signed up in principle for these courses and for this many hours, did they actually do and take these classes, and did they really increase the amount of hours? And so here we use the nice thing of our data that I will describe in a second, is that we have data from the language centers themselves, from the center that taught the language classes. And here we see actually an interesting thing. We see that the enrollment, so this is an estimate of the discontinuity, of the size of the discontinuity and the standard error, or in the 95% interval at January 1st, 1999. And here you see really that that fact that a lot of people signed up for this program didn't mean that there was a massive number of people that enrolled in courses that before were not. They signed up for the program. They continued to enroll in classes at a rate which was not super different, but what they did significantly different after January 1st, 1999 is they really took many more hours, because this enhanced program, which funded and provided to them these hours, really was taken advantage of. So the people signing after January 1st, 1999, they took about 250 more hours of language training. They also have more hours of absence because they do more, but they stayed enrolled for almost 100 a day more. And the period of enrollment from beginning to end, from when they start to when they end, is an increased 200 days. So the idea is that this course was really meaning that people, it's not that before people were completely not going to classes, they were going to these classes offered, but after, by making it mandatory and increasing the number of hours, you really have a significant increase in the hours that people go, in the days that people are enrolled, and in the length of the course. Okay, so just here, just a sense of, wow, I'm sorry, I'm going too slow. So sense of the data, I'm gonna go very fast on this, and I'm gonna start showing you the regression discontinuity results. The idea is that we have to merge these the first group of data, which are data on refugees and data on language training, with the usual labor market, a very rich data set of Denmark. Sample in the end is 8,600 almost refugees who arrived between 18 and 47. We choose this cutoff because we want to follow them on the labor market for 18 years. And we can link them with 9,700 children. So what is the very basic specification that then we do many variation on? Is a linear specification with a regression discontinuity. D is the dummy for being after January 1st, 1999. And so tau is going to be the impact of being in the course. And then X is the number of days since the reform, is the running variable. And why I is a T? Because it's an outcome. And I will show you the outcome can be measured T years after the beginning of the course. So after January 1st, 1999, which is when this policy is implemented. This, I'm going to show you some outcome that I measure the fixed point in time, and then other outcome that we track over time with some sort of dynamic, like dynamic response. The basic specification uses a triangular kernel with the optimal choice according to the standard paper by now, Calonico et al. And it chooses essentially, as keep in mind, the bandwidth in most cases is between 200 and 300 days. Depending on what outcome, it can vary a little bit, the optimal bandwidth. And I will show you all the robustness check on the bandwidth. Okay, first let's check how do the data look like around the discontinuity here in terms of just the number of application and in terms of characteristics to show that this discontinuity has this balance property. So first of all, this is just the number of application is standardized by the total, so is in share of 4 years. And this is from 2 years before to 2 years after by month. As you see, it goes up and down. There is not a massive evidence. There is a little bit of evidence of a bump up before, but if you standardize, there is a seasonality though in this application. Normally December has many more than January, and this happens in every year. And so if you deseasonalize, essentially, you take away the month specific effect, you get this deviation of the application from the average, the month average. And as you see here around the discontinuity, really there is no evidence of any particular bunching before or throat before and bunching after that that would reveal a strategic behavior. More importantly, though, this is the estimate of the discontinuity for a bunch of characteristics of the refugees and for a bunch of characteristics of the municipality where the refugee were sent. In part, all these municipality checks have been done to address the question that Francesco said, if this had changed where these refugees are sent. So, for instance, here, in terms of average age, if they're married, if they're female, if they have children under 3 and so on, all these are very small estimates of the discontinuity around January 1st. And as you see, none of them is significant. The 95% interval includes. This is a measure, Danish 1 to 3, of their skill or which language course they're admitted, and again, not much. And then of the type of refugees. Interestingly, though, we're going to look also if they were more likely to be assigned to large municipality, or what is the employment rate in the municipality where they were assigned, the unemployment rate, some form of income per capita, some form of how dense was the network of other refugees that was there. And all these are very insignificant. The only one almost significant is an urban measure, but then it really depends on how you define urban, because when you look in very large city or small, we don't get very much. So here, the idea is that these outcomes are pretty balanced. So now let me show you the first set of.
So Giovanni, before you turn to the results, this is David McKenzie. Are you going to discuss the Sudvar assumption? I guess the idea that the people on either side of the state are competing with one another in the same labor market, and so anything that you do to help the people with more language training on one side of the date line is also indirectly affecting the job prospects of people on the other side of the date line.
I guess if they are in the same labor market, you're thinking?
Yes, exactly.
You are saying spillovers.
And we know that sort of from the migrant literature that typically the sort of most common substitutes for migrants are other migrants who have more recently arrived just a little bit earlier. And so if we expect
connection, I wanted to ask whether the program is just for refugees or for all immigrants.
It's just for refugees. So the program is just for refugees. And so these people are, in the few thousand. They're not a very large part of the labor market. So, but if they really compete for exactly the same market. So here we, I guess you will look, you will have to identify. So these people are quite dispersed, right? So they don't end up in the same labor market. They are randomly spread. I would say that the aggregate effect of these few refugees finding a job at a 5% is really minuscule. So to think that they have a strong supply effect on the other group is hard to believe. But no, I'm not going to say too much about this. So I'll think a little bit more about that if I guess looking within specific municipality which got a lot of those, one can identify some, if the relative effect I guess are stronger, one can be a little bit worried about the spillover effect. But I guess at this stage, take this as relative effects. So the idea here is that we're going to show, this is just the effect of on the treated relative to the control with the optimal bandwidth, 1 to 18 years after the beginning of the course. And what you observe here is the annual outcomes. These are for employment probability. Actually, it's not probability, it's employment as a share of one being full-time employment. And here is year by year, and here is divided for the two groups, the one under 25, which did not have the welfare cut, and the one over 25, which had it. And in order not to confuse, I do every 4 years. This is a showdown here. So first thing, so as you see here, in the first 3-4 years, people are taking language classes. So in this period, the employment differences of the treated, they are taking these enhanced classes, not very strong. There is a clear emergence in the period in which they finish the language classes, the employment probability increase. Then there is this decline, which is very interesting. This corresponded to the Great Recession in our case. So people who had found a job as refugees, we know that the recession hits more weaker type of worker, also seem to lose that relative advantage of language. But after the recession, they actually regain it. And in the long time, they have it. And this is, if you take the average cumulative, you see that in the long run, there is a permanent effect, which actually is significant. And if you look at the age group, the effects are actually, the young group is much more imprecisely estimated because it's a much smaller group, but they are similar in point estimate, both in terms of yearly and in terms of permanent. One thing that I want to emphasize, the group, the red group had a cut of welfare transfer only in the first year, remember? And so this group, if a cut of welfare transfer encourages going in the labor market, you should expect this to have a stronger effect than the blue. And if anything, here you find a smaller effect. So no real evidence here of that. Earnings follow.
Sorry, Giovanni, one more question on this. Everything you have that I could see in the paper was pooling men and women together.
Yeah.
And yet aren't a lot of the refugees from countries where there's incredibly low labor force participation rates for women, and
so 65% of the refugees are male. If you redo this for male and women separately, you're going to get both sort of significant and similar results, a little bit stronger for women, actually. These participation labor force are, in the longer run, are stronger and a bit more significant for women if you split the two groups. So on earnings, the behavior tracks the employment, but is stronger because we actually find an effect that not only this affects the probability of being employed, but affects the earnings given that. So if you see the increase in employment is a little stronger coming out of the courses and coming out of the recession. So the effect in the long run on cumulative earnings, on average cumulative earnings is strong, permanent, and significant. As I told you, is around $2,500 extra. And even in this case, the effect is relatively similar between young and old people. But if anything, in the early years, there seems to be stronger for young, which again argue against that incentive effect on finding job and getting earning for the old. Here there are some checks. Let me go quick because I want to spend a few minutes on other outcome. If you change bandwidth from 30 days to 360 days, this is our estimate. Only when you take a super minuscule bandwidth of 30 days around, you have this very noisy and imprecise estimate. But for any other, you have estimates which are relatively stable, and then all are around this long-term 4% effect on employment. And then first order, second order, we do all the things that you need to do. And the effect is pretty robust to two different nonlinear specification, donut specification, taking a straight OLS and adding a bunch of controls. So summary is that this 4% effect in employment is what you should keep in mind as permanent effect, and $2,500 is important. We also do some more breaking down. Let me say one thing about the channels before going to the other outcomes. So the channels, an interesting one is that if you look at the dummy, did these people get additional education in Denmark? That also follows a little bit the employment. So some of these people seem to have gotten higher education, so outside of the language training, mostly vocational, both at the end of their courses and getting out of the recession. So these people who were better language speaking probably also could defend themselves a little bit better by taking education, getting out of the recession. And if you look at this, the effect is all on young, really, of this. Of course, getting more education and getting more training seems to be concentrated in young group. While if you look at, did they move towards communication intensive type of occupation relative to manual, again, here with more noise, you observe that as soon as they are done with the course, the treated group seems to take more communication intensive. This deteriorates a little bit after recession, but this effect of being in more communication intensive jobs seems to be even actually stronger for older. So the strategy of older people was to move to communication intensive type of job, given that they couldn't really get a lot of education in the longer run. One interesting effect that we find is that the people who are treated are also more likely not to leave the municipality where they were assigned initially. And that makes sense. To get the benefit of that enhanced course, you have to stay in the municipality where you are. And so we find that in the early year, they are less likely to leave the municipality. But then in the long run, they have the same chances roughly of being in the initial municipality as they were. So it's a little bit of a substitution. These people move less during the course and maybe make up a little bit after the course. How about other outcomes? Other outcomes, let me spend a little bit on crime. Let me tell you that we don't find effect on marriage and no effect on fertility. So I'm gonna jump on that and I'm gonna talk about crime and children in the remaining time. So crime, very interesting effect on crime. I would say that the part in which the young group gets, the older group gets a cut in welfare didn't seem to show any strong effect on anything except on crime. These are convictions and charges of being caught shoplifting in a supermarket. And if you see, very interestingly, the whole treated group seems to have this little bounce up in the first year that then goes to zero, goes to exactly zero in all the charges in the following year. And if you split between under 25, who are the young, who in theory, if you know crime literature, are more likely probably to commit this crime, but they were not touched in terms of welfare transfer. This group does not seem to have any effect from the language. So while this group of people who had the language training but did get the welfare cut just on the first year as a significant jump up of crime in the first year. So of course, all that I'm showing you here is the effect of language and of this cut in the first year. So the bad news, in a sense, is that this language variable does not seem to affect in the long run the crime propensity of this group. And the interesting and the worth delving into short-term effect is that the cut in welfare have this clear and strong short-run effect. We also calculated the effect on available income, and it shows that in this group, the available income in the short run goes down. So maybe this makes sense. Fertility effect, we don't find very much. This is total fertility at the end of fertility age around the discontinuity. No effect. These are the dynamic of when is a child born in the treated versus control, when is the first child born, when is the later child born. Again, not much. And so to conclude, let me tell a little bit about the effect on children. So on children, there is this interesting effect. One important thing is to look whether the father or the mother are treated. Normally the father arrives first. So if the father is treated, the mother is also treated. And the idea is that, let me just show you the result. If you look at the effect on taking exam at school and graduating from lower and being charged of a crime as a juvenile in the early years, and you divide boys and girls, you find some effect. And let me emphasize, the first two columns is when the father is treated, and the second when the mother is treated. You find some effect on improving their exam and school performance and decreasing their crime when they're juvenile, when the father is treated. And this links a little bit to the literature that says that with the father and the sort of situation at home of the father is a strong impact on young boys. These boys were young when their father took the course and then was more or less integrated. So again, these are effects which are a little noisy because depending on who you treat, you get some bumping around. But when we find effect, we find it on boys, which are children of father treated, which means most of the time both are treated, and they show this effect. There is a benefit analysis cost-benefit analysis calculation, which unfortunately I didn't time myself from doing, but just to give you an idea, let me give you, if you look at benefits are the extra wage that people get, and the cost are the cost of running these classes. And then you may even not even worry about the deadweight loss of taxes. There is a much larger benefit to cost ratio, 12 times the benefit, just calculating the present discounted value of the first 18 years of extra wages. And so clearly this seems to be a program that pays for itself in large part over the first 5 years you break even, and it seems to be interesting. So concluding, we seem to find long-lasting positive effect of this program on language, on earnings, on employment, and education. These are interesting effects. As I said, they are not gigantic. They're about 20% of the average, 20 to 25% of the average outcome, which is big relative to the outcome. But given that the outcome in employment and earnings of refugee is at a large disadvantage with natives, doesn't fill the gap. Fills 1/4, 1/3 of the gap with the native. Very interesting, I think, is this this effect of the recession. So these people not only seems to converge a little bit better, but after the recession seems to do better, which was exactly the problem. One of the problems I showed that in Denmark after the recession, refugees seem to not converge, but those who had the language training seems to be better equipped to continue their convergence. And finally, the small evidence that we have on temporary cut on welfare benefits doesn't seem to suggest a very large effect on anything except that there is this short-term spike in shoplifting crime, which could be given by a low income available and a need in the short run, or not the need, but the incentive in the short run to maybe be pushed into that activity. And finally, looking at more social and longer run impact, not much on fertility, but male children, boys, children of refugee. Given the size of the effect, it seems to be significant, something significant to keep in mind. Boys, children of refugee are more likely to graduate or to end school, primary education, and less likely to have a crime by age 16 as a juvenile. And that's the whole thing.
Well, thank you very much, Giovanni. So I think that we have a few questions. Michel Ben wants to start, no?
Yes, thank you very much. A very interesting paper, Giovanni. I had two small questions. Do you have some information about the linguistic skills at the end of the course? Because it's compulsory, so some of them might follow the course because they are highly motivated, and others because they are obliged to do so. And a second question is, do you have some information about the fact that they belong to a big network in their ethnic community? So meaning that after the end of the course, they might practice more or less Danish. So they are going to basically entertain a little bit their linguistic skills that they have acquired during these courses. Yeah.
So the unfortunate thing of the Danish data is that we have everything. So every question that you ask, the answer is that, yeah, we could do that. Unfortunately, in the sense that we can do a lot of things. So more specifically, what do we have? Yeah, so we have information on what type of certificate level these people achieve, which depends though in part of where they start from. You see, because this discontinuity in this case is not on the how well you speak, right? So there are people who start speaking, all of them don't know Danish very well, but they start with very different level of education. They can be low or high. So sometimes it's a little hard to just evaluate the delta in terms of how much they learn there in terms of Danish, but we could definitely sort of have a check that the post period has on average achieves higher certificate level in that. We at some point we did some, and I think we convinced ourselves that these people were actually attending and were actually learning better, but we can include in the paper some. Then in terms of network, so I guess what you're asking, and we can do, and is interesting. So clearly network does not seem to affect where these people are distributed, right? So this is random relative to the network. So the average effect that we estimate is clearly not affected by the network because it's not correlated. You're asking, if you separate people who end up by chance in places with large network of their co-ethnic and a large network, so interact that with where they end up at the beginning, is the effect stronger for people who end up in none? That's a very good point, and I just wrote it down, and we'll do it.
Maybe, Giovanni, a question. How would you reconcile the result that Hillel and Biagio and Alexia had for France with your results? Do you think that it's a question of length of these training programs? I think that in Denmark, moving from 1300 to 1800, it's something important. You already start with a very high number of hours. 1300 is high compared to many other countries. I forgot the number of hours in France, but I think it was much less than this. So is there something we can learn about the optimal duration of these training programs?
Yeah, so let me give it a try, and then Hillel can add. So I definitely think that, yes, so they report results for 100 hours of extra course, which is 1/3. So we have almost 450 extra hours. So the amount of course work can matter for sure. One difference is that they look at relatively short-term outcomes. And maybe as you see in our dynamics, in the early years, right when the people are still taking the course, or they are, maybe it's hard to see, especially if you have a little bit of a noisy sample with not too many observations around the discontinuity. Maybe it's hard in year 2 1, 2, 3, and 4 to find effects. We find that this becomes cleaner and clearer as you go to year 5, 6, 7. So that could be definitely a difference. They also say it actually in the paper that the short run may be also the reason why they find a participation effect and not an employment effect. I think that could be these people are willing to be in the market, but at the beginning unemployment is a typical outcome because it takes a while for them to get. So if you follow them for a longer period. So I would say that one, it's important. I think that all economists have understood this, that this evaluation of programs can be very different 1 year out or 10 years out. And what do we care about? I think we care about to know the dynamics between 1 and 10 years out and see what sticks and what doesn't stick. France is a little different also maybe in terms of the group of people who take these courses. So in Denmark, all the migrants out of them don't speak Danish. There is no migrant from Danish-speaking country. In France, there is a very large number of immigrants from French-speaking country who then typically maybe will not be taking this course. And maybe the one who take this course are the one, therefore, who, I don't know, can be boosted the most by this relative to other immigrants because maybe they have other quality, but they don't speak French very well. So that could be somewhat of a difference there. I liked very much how also their paper tried to look at all the channel. It's not just learning language, it's developing networks and so on. But I was a little bit worried ultimately that they didn't find an effect directly on the language skills. So maybe this course in France were not as effective as some of the Danish. Maybe in Denmark, making them mandatory, sending some good teacher and funding this extra was an important component of it.
Go ahead, Hillel. Yeah.
No, so absolutely, I agree with Giovanni's reading of our paper. He said the results we have are puzzling, and indeed we motivate our last discussion by saying we are puzzled, and so we try to dig in. I think it's still important because in your motivation you kind of differentiated the paper by saying, well, it's not clear that it was language acquisition or something else in our paper or in other papers, while we will go one step further by showing the causal effect of language training. So I think you should really, emphasize this very strongly, and especially show that, it's really the language, because we know there are many, many things going on during those classes. You meet people, you get information, you can get extra motivation. Maybe the 20 hours of civic service themselves have their own multiplicatory effect. So I think this is very important. And I agree that we're capturing short-term effects. What we say is this is the data we have. A priori, participation is a good first step, but we don't know what is beyond. And the last thing is that we also explore the role of cultural distance and showing that if you're too distant culturally, then the program is not effective. In general, we pointed out that the program is not very effective, especially because people don't get too much benefit in terms of language itself. And so this contributed to the reform in these programs. Mm-hmm. Actually, with the number of hours very much increased from a few hundreds to double this.
Yeah, so thank you, Hillel, very true. So yeah, what we don't do too much yet, and I get both your and Michelle's question go to that, is we don't do too much heterogeneity analysis on the typology of refugees. I have to say that in our sample, the lion's share of refugees is Iraq and Afghanistan. And remember, these are refugees before the Iraq and Afghanistan war, right, in 1999. So in a sense, exploiting the cultural distance, maybe France had a more varied group, and I don't know how easy it is, but that's a good point to look at what happens if they end up in network, what happens if they have different cultural distances in a heterogeneity analysis. So the average effect is that, but how does it differ? Yeah, good point.
We have 5 minutes remaining. So Simone, do we have questions from the non-panelists?
Yes, I'm going to allow a few of them to speak. Eli, if you want to.
Yeah, a very, very interesting paper, Giovanni, thank you. I was wondering whether you have looked at any effect on application or obtention of the permanent residency. I was wondering, or citizenship, I was wondering whether it could be that your effects, your labor market effects are mediated by obtention of permanent residency or citizenship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we definitely, I'm not sure. I'll have to check actually with Mette and Linea if we have the data on application for citizenship of this group. So we have not done it yet, but it's a great idea, and we'll check if we can do it. Yep.
We can see if it changed.
From Giacomo. Yeah.
Yeah, if it's changed, we can see if
citizenship.
Citizenship. Do we have that info? Yeah. So yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Yep, the citizenship something.
So Giacomo Battistone here. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It's very interesting. I have a question relating to the mechanism. So I would be interested into understanding whether this is a matter of migrants having a easier time searching for a job, or whether this is a whole new set of jobs that's open for them. And so I'm asking whether you can observe the occupations where they end up in and assess whether they end up in occupations that interact more with the public, for example.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to go. Yeah, so the answer is that that's what this graph, in a very quick way, was trying to do. So the graph in which we look at the communication intensity. So typically in this occupation ONET type of measure, in which you look at the task used in an occupation, communication, which means verbal and written communication with other people, is a good proxy for how much contact in your job you have with other people. So this spike that you see here, and then this increase says that these people on average were moving into occupation which were using more communication, so they had more relationship with other Danish people. So to a first round of approximation, yes. We also did one which was more targeted to individual occupation. We actually found that the single occupation that grew the most, the type, are those of personal and health services. A lot of women after this type of courses ended up in healthcare, those type of occupation in which you take care, not necessarily nurses, which are a little bit more specialized, by healthcare aid, which clearly has a communication component. And in many of these countries, you know, a lot of this is a highly valued type of jobs, but you need some. So for especially women, that was one important channel. So I would say that I interpret this as saying that this language proficiency opens them up the possibility of being in some occupation that before, with the low language skills, it was very hard for them to access, and certainly for a group that has been true.
Thanks.
Okay, so just one quick question, Giovanni. I was wondering about heterogeneity of the effects by country of origin, because in Denmark, I was asking myself whether coming from an English-speaking country can already allow you to get a decent job because your language is already valuable on the local labor market.
Yes, so as I said, the big group here, which were Afghani, Iraqi, and maybe Somali. No, maybe not Somali. Somali we have to take out actually because they had a problem in some categorization. Are Arabic, they're not English speaking. So we'll have to go in. Maybe there are some smallish African countries which are English speaking that send some. I am not sure that the amount, you know, around the discontinuity, keep in mind that 300 days, a few thousands of observation will end up with a thin sample. But yeah, definitely we're going to do some, after the suggestion you gave, we're going to do some about some heterogeneity analysis by language, by distance, by network measure. Those are all very, very, very valid points. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And I thank you very much. So as we are closing, I thank the listener, I thank the question in the panel. This has been extremely valuable for us.
Thanks a lot to you and to Mette and Linea, Giovanni.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
So we are done. Next week, Simone, we have Esther Arenas Arroyo, right, from Vienna?
Yes.
So same time, 5:30?
Same time, and Jesus will be chairing the seminar next week.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you, everybody. Big thanks to Giovanni
to all of you. Thanks for having been online with us, and possibly see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.